the fact that you thought that this was the biggest single day of slaughter is part of the problem. The Israeli media all the time reports that significant casualties were inflicted by Israeli forces themselves.
Some people tried to describe what Hamas did that day as resistance.
No, killing grandmas and kids is terrorism. It suited Israel that Hamas were there. Almost 40 years after the agreement, there's not 1 centimetre of Palestine free. What do you expect from an open-air prison camp but a prisoner's revolt?
You're perceived to be somebody very sympathetic to Russia.
There's a cult of Nazism.
There's also
in
a cult
Ukraine.
of supporting people like Putin. What part of you is so naive, George, that you think that Putin is going to stop there?
I'm against war.
Against what? Unless
against
it's one,
war.
unless
And
it's your
especially
Russia,
I'm
mate.
against-
You trust Vladimir Putin
I trust him more
than Keir
I
Starmer.
trust him more than I trust Joe Biden.
Who's going to win the US election?
This democracy you talk of is a farce. We're just not on the same page.
No, we're
on
not.
this.
George Galloway has had more comebacks than Frank Sinatra. He even has the hat to match. He's a gifted orator, a firebrand populist, and one of the most controversial politicians of our time. Many millions have seen his blistering rebuke of the US Senate over the Iraq War, clips of which still often go viral today, and I was one of the people who cheered him on. But it's his strident support for the Palestinian cause that led to many of our viewers on both sides of that debate to call for him to appear on Uncensored, and he joins me in the studio now. George, good to see you.
Pleasure.
Been a while.
Glad we're both still here.
The old survivors.
Yes.
Look, you and I have locked horns many times about many different things.
Sure.
In all the time that you've debated issues, have you ever come across one more divisive than Israel-Palestine?
Probably not.
Particularly in the last 8 months.
Yeah, I mean, probably not. There have been others. I mean, I was plastered on the front page of The Sun in 1990 for meeting Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness under the 42-point bold headline traitor. That was hot at the time, but who now would say that it was not right to have met and talked and brought in from the cold the leaders of what was an armed struggle within our own country. George O is definitely better than war. There are others. Russia, for example, is a divisive, controversial one. But yeah, you're right. As your show has proved. Now, a lot of people, a lot of friends of mine, think you've been awful on this issue. I say in mitigation, at least you have brought on hundreds, I think, well, certainly dozens, scores maybe, of voices that wouldn't have made it elsewhere.
No question.
Onto the media. And although I'm now appearing on you, you have been asking me for quite some time to come on. So I'm one of those that acquits you of that. But it is an issue that separates the sheep from the goats, the wheat from the chaff. I personally believe that when history comes to be written, just as it was written over the Holocaust in the late 30s and 40s, those that turned their faces away from mass slaughter, even though they must have known that it was going on, have not emerged well from history. And I think the same will be true over this.
I have used the phrase from the start of this that I have felt a genuine moral quandary. And I'll explain to you why and get your response. So from October the 7th, I felt it was on a scale completely unprecedented for one day of slaughter that we have seen in that entire conflict, that it was so barbaric, so medieval, so inhuman in the way it was executed against so many, in the main, young, innocent people at festivals, in kibbutzes and so on, that I felt you had to start this debate about what's going on with a clear denunciation of what happened that day. Then the question for me became twofold. The scale of Israel's response and what was proportionate. I didn't have that answer. I said I would see how it played out and make an assessment. And secondly, what was the end game and what would happen the day after the war ends? And on those second and third points, I have grown increasingly critical of what Israel's been doing, particularly since they began attacking a refugee camp in Rafah where they've been sending everybody. And I thought that excuse of we're trying to be targeted to Hamas when it's clear that you can't be targeted when you attack a refugee camp, I thought crossed a line for me. But also cognizant of two things. One, Israel's right to defend itself and a duty to defend itself after the scale of what happened, and because the Hamas spokesman said we're going to keep doing it. So they had that. But secondly, that uniquely in Gaza, half of the population of 2 million are under 18. This is a place that is jam-packed with children. And when Hamas embed themselves among civilians, as they do...
Well, where else could they embed themselves? It's a prison camp.
I accept that, and I'll come to that part of it. I'm sure there will be many parts of this debate where you and I will agree. There will be some where we don't agree. And I still have no evidence that there's any endgame plan by Israel. And I think you're now seeing the Israeli government fracturing with people recognising there is no after-the-war plan. And it could be complete and utter chaos. And there are certainly people on that cabinet, I think, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and others, who have been talking in a genocidal way about this. So that's where I am with this. But I've started a lot of interviews with pro-Palestinian guests, and I'll do it with you. And it's been a sort of controversial thing. People have sort of mocked me for it, but I kind of think it's a good starting point that to go back to October the 7th, when you realise the scale of what had happened that day, do you condemn what happened that day?
Well, I have to first correct you on something. It was by no means the single biggest slaughter in the Israel-Palestine chapter.
In one day?
In one day. In fact, in 5 hours, with Sharon on the roof shining a searchlight into the Sabra and Shatila camps in Beirut, 3,850 Palestinian women and children. There were only women and children because the men had all agreed to sail away to Tunisia as part of an American brokered deal. Now, younger viewers will not remember Sabra and Shatila, but those two names are burned in the minds of those older and who care about it. So that's triple the actual death toll on October the 7th.
Well, nearly 7,000 more were wounded on October the 7th.
Yeah, but the fact that you thought, I mean this respectfully, that this was the biggest single day of slaughter is part of the problem. The lives, the blood of Palestinians is oftentimes by commentators and politicians regarded as less valuable than the blood of Israelis. All the blood is a disgrace, all of it. And insofar as terrorist acts are committed by Palestinian organizations, by terrorists I mean the harming, killing of innocent civilians, of course I condemn that.
So do you accept, on that then, do you accept, because the number you gave for the other atrocity, which is what it was, is disputed, you know it's disputed. So...
The Sabra Shatila?
Yeah, the actual toll is disputed.
Well, the death toll on October 7th is
Well, I know you dispute it, but there's more clarity about the numbers on that.
No, there isn't, because the Israeli media reports have not been reflected in Western reports. But the Israeli media all the time reports that significant casualties were inflicted by Israeli forces themselves, and deliberately under Netanyahu's Hannibal directive, which states that no one should be allowed to be taken hostage, kill them, rather than allow them to be taken hostage.
But over 230 were taken hostage.
Yeah, and taking women.
And the latest figures are that 1,143 people were killed in the initial series of terror attacks, 373 of whom were linked to security forces, 766 of whom were civilians. Now, you've questioned those before. Do you question those now?
No, I question who killed whom, but I don't eschew condemnation of the killing of innocent civilians. If you show me an old woman who was killed by a Palestinian fighter...
Well, they showed it themselves. I mean, they broadcast many of the atrocities to the world.
I absolutely condemn that. I also condemn the taking of women and children as hostages, whether they're taken by the Israeli government, and there are 9,000 hostages in Israeli dungeons, that are untried, not even charged. They're just held there as hostages. And I condemn the holding of civilian hostages
do you think
in
what
Gaza.
do you think what Hamas did that day was a terrorist attack?
Well, the parts that I'm talking about were undoubtedly a terrorist attack.
Right.
But if
You see,
the
look, I wasn't expecting you to say that, and the reason I think it's significant, George, is a lot of people have sat in that chair on the Palestinian side of this debate, and they have including Jeremy Corbyn, I might add, who have resolutely refused to condemn what Hamas did that day. And I find that very difficult to get past.
Well,
I've often...
I understand that.
I've ended up with 20-minute debates, as I did with Corbyn, about it, because I don't see how any human being cannot tell that what it is.
Killing innocent civilians, whether on London Bridge or on the London Underground or at a music festival, are terrorist acts because they are punishing innocent people for the crimes of guilty people. Now, I was underground as an agent of the ANC in apartheid South Africa. I was working for Nelson Mandela's ANC. I gave my blood on the floor of the Guguletu police station in Cape Town. Was the ANC a terrorist organization? The answer to that is no, even though they had people who carried out terrorist attacks. You have to understand the whole picture and not just a tiny corner of a single snapshot. The ANC, like the Palestinians, are fighting against an apartheid state. In the case of Palestine, the millions of Palestinians scattered around the world with no one speaking up for them. And from time to time...
When people categorize what Hamas did on October 7th as resistance... Do you think that's an acceptable choice of word for what happened that day?
If you're fighting against occupation forces, undoubtedly it is. So if you cross the wire, break out of the wire of the concentration camp, it was David Cameron, I remind you, who called it the largest open-air prison camp in the world. If you break through and you start taking a toll on your guards, the people who've kept you in this absolute immiseration, penury, with regular death being dealt to you, then that's a legitimate act of resistance.
But it's not legitimate to attack kids and grandmothers.
I already said that.
No, that's what I mean. That's why I mean.
Yeah.
Some people try to describe what Hamas did that day as resistance.
No, killing grandmas and kids is terrorism.
It's not resistance.
It's not resistance.
Right.
It's terrorism.
That's my point.
But killing soldiers and security officers of the Israeli state is enshrined in international law. When you used the phrase earlier about Israel having the right to defend itself, it literally does not have the right. It's excluded.
Every country has the right to defend itself.
It's excluded in international law that any country has the right to defend itself from territories that it illegally occupies. So the occupied have that right.
Hang on. As you've just said, many acts of terrorism were committed that day, and every country has a fundamental right to defend its people from terrorism. You would agree with that?
Yes, from terrorism.
Right.
But
so Israel does have a right to, because the Hamas spokesman, I think critically for this debate, the Hamas spokesman within several weeks on camera said, we will keep trying to do this again and again.
Well, I'm not a supporter of Hamas.
I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying, I'm saying in terms of Israel's right to defend itself, indeed, I would say a moral duty. Now, the scale of it we're going to come to, and there we might meet some common ground. But on the principle of if you suffer a terror attack of that nature, in the way that it was perpetrated, that Israel has a fundamental right and a duty to its people, if the perpetrators say we're going to keep trying to do this, to defend itself. You would agree with that?
But to defend yourself by killing and mutilating 150,000 people and climbing, Save the Children have just said there are 21,000 missing children on top of the 15,000.
Oh, we don't have these figures. These figures have not been confirmed.
Well, you can believe Save the Children or not. I agree. I think they're a pretty reputable organisation.
I believe
Princess Anne is their patron.
It is widely accepted that up to about 40,000 people so far have died. We don't know how many of those are Hamas. Israel would have you believe it's 15,000.
Well, I've seen a lot of pictures of people who are manifestly not Hamas.
I agree.
So have you.
I agree. And I think the slaughter of the children has been horrific.
Yeah,
Horrific.
and inevitable.
Yeah.
Inevitable.
It is inevitable. But I also think
if you defend yourself by raining down bombs on tents, it is inevitable that you are going to kill and mutilate children and women who cannot possibly be Hamas.
But Hamas would have known that Israel would respond in that way.
Yes, but Israel would have known that if you keep 2.3 million people in a cage, they're going to try and break out. So there's all kinds of concomitant should have knowns in this story. They should have known when they occupied Palestinian land, drove hundreds of thousands of them out, never to return, that those people would have children and they would have children, and enmity, bitterness, and a desire for revenge would exist forever. And so it has. Now, the Gaza people maybe were unlucky. They were driven out only to Gaza, not to the neighboring countries. And they had a fence put around them. And by the way, this is something I think you should acknowledge. It suited Israel that Hamas were there. They begged Qatar to keep on funding Hamas.
I agree with you.
Because they didn't want Arafat, my friend.
Let me clear that.
They wanted an Islamist enemy.
Netanyahu liked the idea of the Palestinian governments being split between Palestinian Authority and Hamas. It suited him that they were divided, that there wasn't a unity governing the Palestinian people. That is why he helped authorize these billions being sent through to Hamas. And Hamas then, in my opinion, abused that money and used it to build the tunnels where they went down, but they didn't let the civilians go down, to arm themselves to the teeth and plan attacks, right? So I don't remotely excuse Netanyahu from this. I actually think going out of this
goes much further back. Piers, I was there, saw it with my own eyes.
Well,
the birth of Hamas.
Right, but
I mean,
they were given power in 2005. Is my point.
But it's existed for 38 years.
Right, but then they got governmental power in 2005.
Sure, but I've been involved for 50 years. So I can tell you that I saw with my own eyes the deliberate bringing into being of an Islamist resistance set of organizations to stymie Yasser Arafat. They didn't want Arafat. They didn't want the likes of my friend, the next legitimate president, the Nelson Mandela of Palestine, Marwan Barghouti. Many of his family members have been on your show.
Yeah,
Marwan Barghouti, they want to keep him in a dungeon because he represents an ideal that unites people of all religions and none. Has an ability to attract people around the world to the nobility of his cause. So kill and jail all the people like that. Make a bogeyman of an Islamist enemy. Make sure he continues to be funded by Arab regimes that you are able to order around. And that's what happened. That's not to say that the resistance fighters who are now taking a heavy toll on Netanyahu's invaders, very heavy. It's now 9 months. They still haven't quashed the resistance in these camps.
Well, they're not going to defeat Hamas in its entirety.
No, and some have acknowledged
and they certainly, in my opinion, the massive flaw with this strategy, I think they are fueling, not ending the ideology.
For sure.
I can't imagine that the amount of bloodshed of civilians we've seen is not going to inspire a lot more people to embrace the revenge ideology that Hamas have represented.
Didn't we discover that ourselves in our own country? When we interned, without trial, thousands of Roman Catholics in the north of Ireland, we guaranteed the struggle of the Irish Republican Army for decades afterwards. We made a university for them behind the wire. This kind of failure to address legitimate grievances of people can only generate future hatred.
See, I believe fundamentally every Palestinian should have exactly the same human rights and freedoms as every Israeli.
Me too.
Right?
Me
On
too.
that we agree.
Me too.
Right, the question is...
And within one state it will have to be, because the two-state solution, which I supported as an Arafatist, I look foolish now, having supported the Oslo Agreement. I look like an idiot.
Why?
Arafat looks like an idiot. Because we believed that there would be a two-state solution. And almost 40 years after the agreement, there's not 1 centimeter of Palestine free. And Gaza is in complete ruins. The West Bank is on fire. Settlers are running amok. The attempt to ethnically cleanse the West Bank and East Jerusalem is running concurrently with the slaughter in Gaza. So where are you going to put two-state solution?
Well, I would add a massive but to that, which is, but one of the main reasons for this current mayhem is what Hamas did on October the 7th.
I don't agree at all with that. And
you have to agree with that.
The chronology makes it clear that that's not true. There's 800,000 illegal settlers in the West Bank. They all settled there long before October the 7th.
I think, look, again, for the record, the expansion of the settlements, particularly since October the 7th, is completely outrageous. It shouldn't be happening.
99.9% of them were all built before October the 7th. It's as foolish to think that this all began on October 7th. I know you don't, but many commentators feel that way, talk that way, that it all begins when the Sky News cameras
One of the best pieces
up.
I've read on this whole thing, I'll tell you, was quite early on. Jonathan Friedland, who's a Jewish columnist for The Guardian. And he wrote a really, I think, amazing column in which he said, I can present, as a Jewish man, a very clear, coherent argument for why both sides have a right to feel most aggrieved in this 75-year conflict. It was a really interesting piece where he didn't take a position. He just explored the arguments on both sides, went back to 1948, and through a series of spiraling circumstances, hundreds of thousands displaced on both sides in those first few years, that ultimately you end up with a lot of very aggrieved people being pushed and shoved out of their homes. A lot of bloodshed starts. You then have a series of wars almost entirely started by the Arab side, but then the response from Israel often being massively disproportionate.
Well, you say started by the Arab side.
I'm talking about the specific flare-ups of war.
Well, the 1973 war was an attempt to get back the territories of 1967. The resistance from 1948 onwards was because the country called Palestine was wiped off the map and its people scattered to the four winds. They're never going to accept that. Neither would you. We wouldn't accept it in our own country.
But can you put yourself in the shoes?
If someone came from New York and took over your house, Piers, you would never accept it.
I understand that. What I'm saying is, can you accept that if Jonathan Friedland, as a Jewish man, can find it in his heart to see that the Palestinians have had real cause for grievance, can you, as somebody who supports the Palestinian side, can you understand why Jewish people, why Israelis also feel a burning sense of grievance and injustice for what they've endured at the same time?
Well, they endured it at the hands of Christian Europeans, not at the hands of the Palestinians.
Can you accept that they do feel that and have a right to?
I know that they feel it. It's my job to empathise, to understand, to walk in the other fellow's shoes. But the facts cannot be changed. There once was a Palestine, now there is not. The people came from New York, from Paris and London and all over Europe and took their homes and took their land. No one's ever going to accept that. There will always be resistance to that. As long as there are two Palestinians left alive, male and female, there will be a Palestinian resistance. It's a failure to grasp that which has led to this. Now, I said 1948, I could go back. I was in a building in Manchester, in Cheetham Hill, last Saturday night, where the Balfour Declaration was received and co-signed by the Zionist organizations. I was literally in the building. It's a big Manchester story. Balfour himself was an MP in Manchester. The document was signed in Manchester. The reality is, when we promised, on behalf of one people, to give to a second people the land that belonged to a third people, we set off, as Churchill put it, down a descending staircase, soaked in blood. That's why British people, when some people say, why are you so exercised by this? Because my country caused it, and my country is still involved in it. That's why I'm so exercised by it.
We are where we are now. How does this get resolved? And how long will it take?
I don't think it's going to be resolved, and therefore cannot give a timescale. There's never going to be a two-state solution until, a surgeon can't operate on his own foot. Until outside surgeons operate on this, it's not going to be resolved. As long as we keep giving Israel
When
the
you see
money,
the Abraham Accords, you see normalization of relations with Arab countries and Israel. You see that Saudi clearly want to pursue the same path. Is that not ultimately the way it has to go?
how will that help resolve the Palestinian
Well,
issue?
the question then is who will help rebuild and govern the people in Gaza after this? And that is a question which is open for a lot of debate. I mean, there's no easy answer, clearly, but what do you think?
You call it normalization, but there's nothing normal about these regimes that concluded under Trump's browbeating and bribery and the judicious deployment of his son-in-law. There's nothing normal about these countries. Their populations, 99.99% of them, are with the Palestinians and are against this normalization. This is a Potemkin village. And even Trump, I think, will not seek to resurrect the Abraham Accords. The Oslo Accords are dead. The Abraham Accords never got off the ground because none of them have solved the fundamental problem of Palestinian statehood, of the return of the Palestinian refugees to their own land, their own homes, for which they have the title deeds written in English and countersigned and sealed with a stamp by British judicial authorities. You, I say it again, you nor I would ever accept anyone stealing our house. And no matter how long they live there, it will never be theirs. It will always be mine.
It is also a fact in the history of planet Earth in the last 1,000 years that where there is warfare, there is a change in territorial ownership that goes with warfare, right? And there have been, how many, 5 wars now in this conflict in 75 years? So when that happens, you are going to get changes in geography, aren't you?
It goes with warfare as long as the victims disappear into the museum. But insofar as they don't, and Arafat always used to say, we are not the Red Indians, we will not go into the museum, let people come and see our gowns and our cooking utensils in an exhibition case. As long as the Palestinians remain alive and insist on their rights, there will be resistance. The rest of us have to make up our mind, why are we so enthralled to a very small country of 7 or 8 million Israelis that we are prepared to risk what might become World War III over defending it? If, as we are speaking, Israel invades Lebanon, Hezbollah in Lebanon will be a Donnybrook, a battle royal, which may very well immediately draw in the Americans.
Well, the last time this happened, it actually didn't turn out to be that at all.
It didn't, because Hezbollah gave them a bloody good hiding.
Well, they didn't.
As I said on Sky News on my biggest ever clip.
But that's all that happened.
Israel ran away.
No, Israel didn't.
And Hamas, Hezbollah are now...
That's a shocking mischaracterization of what happened.
What happened then?
Hezbollah did not see off Israel the last time they clashed.
Well, I think we need to go back and check the news clippings of that.
But Israel gave Hezbollah a pretty big bloody nose.
Well, you're the only person I've ever heard say that. But
really?
But only. But
I'm the only person who thinks so.
I'm the only person I have ever heard say that. Everybody else believes Hezbollah gave Israel a bloody good hiding. But the most important
Why did they stop there then? If they were winning, why did they stop?
Well, the most important thing is...
Why did they stop?
The most important thing is Hezbollah is now 10, 20, 50 times more powerful than it was in 2006. They are hundreds of thousands of men under arms. They have the best arms. They have Russian anti-aircraft missiles. They have Iranian ballistic missiles. They could turn Israel into a giant firestorm. So if Netanyahu does this, we're going to have to make up our mind whether we want to risk an international conflagration to save Netanyahu and his gang.
Well, I don't think there's any incentive for Netanyahu to bring an end to any warfare at the moment.
No, that's
because
right.
The moment it is, all the polls suggest the Israeli people will kick him out of office, and then the next phase of his life will be in a court facing corruption charges.
Sure.
So I don't see any future after this war ends for Netanyahu or half of more of that cabinet. But I don't see any future for Hamas either in having any form of governing over the people of Gaza. Do you?
I don't think they care about governing.
But do you think they should have any
I think
governing
the
role?
Palestinians should pick their leaders, not Piers Morgan or George Galloway. But the point is...
Rob, you disagree with me about Israel.
They're not going to have...
You're giving a view about Israel. You can give one about Palestine.
I support Marwan Barghouti. I want him released from jail and to be the president of both parts.
But you accept that Hamas, after what happened on October the 7th, they should have no governing responsibility at any level?
Well, unless the Palestinians pick them. The point is, though, they've no interest in governing. They're a liberation organization, a resistance organization,
a terrorist
with
organization.
with an Islamist ideology, which will continue and will in fact become stronger by the failure of the West to be that surgeon operating on Israel's foot.
Isn't Islamist ideology terrorism?
No, not all of it. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood are Islamists, but they're not terrorists. There are the ANC had a terrorist wing, as was described. There are all kinds of parts of these organizations, but their ideology, which I don't support, don't share, is strengthened by what's happened over the last 9 months.
I think that may well be the case.
I'm sure of it.
I've been worried about that.
I lived through it. I lived through Arafat's support going down and down and down because of his failure to deliver what he said the Oslo Agreement was going to bring. He said, I'll be there, I'll be praying in the Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, we'll have a state in the West Bank and Gaza. And as the years went by and people saw no such thing, they began to turn to other political forces. And it suited the West, it suited Israel, not just in this theater. For your very much older viewers, they did the same in Egypt. They built up the Muslim Brotherhood because they hated Nasser. They hated Nasser because he nationalized the Suez Canal and began to spark the idea of Arab national unity and so on across the region. So they built up these Islamist forces.
But if you don't have a two-state solution, George, how does this ever lead to peace?
The way you described it, that's why I'm instantly agreed with you. Let's call it the Holy Land. If you like, we can call it Israel-Palestine. One country between that famous river and that famous sea, where every Jew, Muslim and Christian lives as an equal. That's what we did at the end of apartheid in South Africa.
But how do they live as peaceful equals, given what's happened?
Well, it'll never be perfect any more than it is in Northern Ireland or in South Africa now. But any alternative proposal has the disbenefit of having obviously been debunked. The two-state solution is debunked. Nobody believes in it, least of all Israel, that would have to clear the 800,000 settlers off the land that's supposed to be the Palestinian state. That's not going to work. Now, you may say, this will never happen. I tell you, it will not happen in my lifetime. But my youngest child is 3 years old. I believe it can happen in hers. If we stop endlessly bankrolling, arming, diplomatically covering for, culturally fluffing the state of Israel and begin to be at least even-handed in the way that you are now being. Be even-handed. Recognize that the Palestinians have rights too and that Palestinian lives matter too. In 100 years, maybe we'll get to the Holy Land.
I have said that about equal rights from the start of this. The moral quandary I've had, which I've articulated throughout, is simply the scale of what Hamas did on that day was so horrific that it was inevitable Israel would respond with huge force. I have massive concerns about the scale of what they've been doing, particularly in the last few weeks and months. But when you have a group that is publicly wedded to your annihilation,
actually, they're far be it from me to defend Hamas, but they are publicly wedded to the two-state solution. They made an historic climb down at least 20 years ago in accepting Arafat's Oslo Agreement. So it isn't true that they are wedded to
but their founding charter literally spells out they want the elimination of Israel.
Have you seen Likud's founding charter?
Sure.
It is the mirror image of that. Forget founding charters. Hamas is wedded to the two-state solution, the very failed two-state solution that we are discussing here.
The Hamas official spokesman, literally 2 weeks after October the 7th, said on camera, What they're really wedded to is repeating this again and again and again.
But that's what they're resisting the occupation.
That's not resistance, it's terrorism. You've already agreed with me it's terrorism.
Part of it was terrorism.
A massive part of it.
Well, we could argue about the numbers. We'd have to know the Hannibal Directive. But it is the desperate act of occupied people trapped in a concentration camp, 2.3 million of them, with no exit and no entrance. What do you expect from an open-air prison camp but a prisoner's revolt? And now the guards are raining down widespread death and destruction on them. That's only going to make the matter worse. I think we agree on that.
I think that's probably, sadly, exactly what's going to happen. Let me ask you, you were very critical of Sir Keir Starmer, likely to be the new British Prime Minister in several weeks' time. You warned that he would pay a high price for his stance on this war. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that millions of people who almost certainly would have trooped out to vote Labour very loyally or even holding their nose will not now do so. Millions of those are Muslims, but millions of them are not. If you look at any protest, demonstration, manifestation of any kind, it's mainly non-Muslims that are there. It's mainly young people, students. It's mainly people that Jeremy Corbyn would once have had in his coalition. And by the way, Corbyn will get more votes, got more votes in 2017 than Starmer's going to get in 2024. Mark my card on that. The coalition that Labour could have had is not the coalition that they will have on the 4th of July. And the reason will largely be down to Gaza. There are other reasons, but that's the biggest one. No self-respecting supporter of the Palestinians is going to vote Labour, whoever the candidate is. And now there are plenty of alternatives.
But what will be the heavy price he pays, given he's going to win with a massive majority?
Well, we've yet to see how big the majority will be. I haven't given up hope of a hung parliament, which would be the best parliament. No, I haven't, because I think the rise of Farage is not finished yet. And I think that Farage is taking a significant number of Labour voters in the blue wall, formerly the red wall. I can tell you that anecdotally.
Do you feel an affinity with Mr. Farage?
No, we are pretty much diametric opposites.
I mean, on Russia, you can barely put a bit of paper between you.
On Brexit, too. So a stop clock is right twice a day.
Right.
And Farage was right at twice on those 2 days.
Was he right on Brexit, given it appears to have been a spectacular act of self-harm?
He was definitely right on Brexit. We fought for Brexit, people like me, because it was necessary but not sufficient.
Take back control of our borders, for example?
Well, we certainly haven't done that.
Since the referendum 8 years ago, literally we're now in a position from tens of thousands of people in a net migration situation to 700,000.
Yeah.
And we have tens of thousands
scores of thousands coming over illegally.
I mean, that's not taking back control.
Yeah, but
that's completely losing control.
We have lost control of our borders, and we haven't taken control of our economy in a way that we could have done.
So how has it worked? I mean, look, I voted. Let me be clear. I voted Remain, but I wasn't sure. I didn't feel. I felt both sides were misleading me. I wasn't sure, and when it was over, I actually voted for Boris Johnson in 2019 for one reason. He was the only candidate in that election who was prepared to honour the result of the referendum. And I felt for a democratic society like Britain that actually incredibly important that we be seen to honour the results, right? Whether it's general election, local election, or a referendum. That was the only reason I voted for it.
Yeah, well, that's perfectly logical, and I think many people did that, especially in what became the Blue Wall.
Well, should we not have another referendum now if Keir Starmer was to win?
No, because
most polls suggest the vast majority would now vote to go back in.
Yeah, my stance is that we never actually Brexited. We never regained our sovereignty. We continued to tail end the European Union on almost all important matters, and worse, we became a vassal, an even greater state of vassalage of the United States. And if Trump gets back in, that's going to continue. So we never actually became an independent country. We believe that being an independent country is a necessary but not sufficient condition.
I think we ceded so much of our authority on the global stage that actually being a leading member of the EU gave us so much more clout than being a little island with little island mentality.
And
that had it worked, had we got the border controlled, had we got the economy purring, have any of the things we've been promised actually worked? If we got our 350 million per week for the
off
NHS,
that bus and into the
NHS was transformed, if any of these things had worked,
and if my auntie had a beard, she'd be my uncle.
Right, but we were promised all this and nothing's happened.
Yeah, and the people that promised you it deserve to be held to account for it. But that wasn't Farage. He's not in government.
Well, he was one of the main reasons we went through with it.
But the government that has been in power since we Brexited is the people you should blame.
Let me ask you about Russia. I mean, you're perceived to be somebody very sympathetic to Russia, to the extent that in the Ukraine war, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but with the Ukraine war, you feel that this was not necessarily a justified, but an inevitable response.
Provoked. I'll go with
which is what Farage says.
Yeah, and not just Farage, but Macron today, who said he's going to continue his dialogue with Putin.
Well, you have to try and forge peace.
In a way, that's all that Farage was.
But in terms of his provocation, I'm very curious about this, because here's my thing about the provocation. Ukraine voted by a massive majority, 90-something% of the people in the 90s, to become an independent, democratic, sovereign country in Europe. And they were then persuaded by the international community to give up their nuclear deterrent defence.
Well, it wasn't theirs, it was the Soviets.
Okay, but they were persuaded to give up their weapons.
Yeah, but it wasn't theirs.
And part of
Russia was the inheritor state.
But the deal was that if they did that, then they would be guaranteed their independence. What could be more independent than, in Ukraine's case, for example, wanting to be, off their own volition, a member of NATO?
But we had
which is a defensive alignment.
In 2014, there was a government that did not want to do those things, and it was overthrown in a coup d'etat. The parliament on fire, the president fleeing for his life, and the first act of the terrorized deputies, literally with a gun at their head, was to outlaw the Russian language. Now, 1/3 of the Ukrainian people are Russian-speaking people, including Zelensky, the greatest showman on earth. I could call him something else, but let's...
Well, what else would you call him?
I'd call him a thief. I'd call him a fraud. I'd say that he fooled the Ukrainian people, that he was going to make peace
I'd call him an absolute hero. And I would say back at you, George, that for such a smart guy, and you are a smart guy, I've met a lot of politicians, you're right up there in terms of your intellect. It seems to me that you're more comfortable just going along with the Putin worldview than you are going along with the view of someone that Putin has barbarically, illegally invaded. I mean, you and I agreed about the illegal invasion of Iraq. We thought it was completely wrong, right, that America and the UK and the other allied forces invaded Iraq as retribution for something they had nothing to do with. And it turned out to be a total disaster that spawned...
And we both got sacked.
And we both got sacked, right? And we agreed about that, which is why I'm really struck by the fact that we disagree so vehemently about what seems to me a very similar situation.
No, but because you've got to know the history, and you should know it.
I do know the history.
Russia has been invaded twice, by Napoleon and then by Hitler, using the runway of Ukraine. The idea that Russia is going to allow American missiles masquerading as NATO missiles on the soil of the place where Russia was twice invaded in the last couple of hundred years.
Do you know how much of Russia is one of the biggest landmass country in the world, right? Do you know how much of it, percentage-wise, is bordered by NATO countries, including Finland, who's just come into it?
Yeah, if you put a nuclear...
Do you know how many?
If you put a nuclear...
Hang on, that's a different question. That's a different question. What percentage is actually bordered by NATO countries?
Well, you've got the
including
Baltic
Finland.
states, and if you had Ukraine...
Do you know the answer?
No.
Right, have a guess.
10, 15?
10%.
Yeah.
10%, a tiny percentage
what
of
does
Russia's
that mean?
border.
What it means is a missile takes
NATO is not...
A missile takes less than 2 minutes.
NATO is a defensive organisation.
Tell that to the birds. Tell that to the people of Libya.
Why
Tell
do you think? Why do you think so many?
Yugoslavia.
Why do you think so many of the former countries in the Soviet Union are racing to want to be part of it? Because they are fearful not of NATO attacking them, but of Russia attacking them.
No, look,
like he did in Grozny, like he did in Georgia, like he did in Crimea, like he's now done in Ukraine. Why do you keep trusting this guy?
Is it important to stick to the facts? The facts are these. Russia was promised, Gorbachev was promised by the United States, by James Baker, the Secretary of State, to George Bush I, that if the Red Army left eastern Germany, NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east of Germany. They have expanded thousands of kilometers to the east of Germany, and they now have nuclear missiles within 2 minutes of hitting St. Petersburg.
You're not answering my question. Why have these former countries, part of the old Russian Empire, why have they been so keen to join an alliance which is a defensive alliance? It's not because they want to be aggressive to Russia. It's because they want to be defended when Russia almost inevitably attacks them.
If they're defensive, why did they bombard Belgrade for 90 days? If they're defensive, why are there ships sailing in the South China Sea as far away from the North Atlantic as it's possible for a NATO warship to be?
Why are there Russian airplanes flying over Europe?
Actually, there are virtually no Russian airplanes.
Virtually no, that's comforting.
Virtually none.
That's comforting. How many are there?
But I'll tell you something.
Well, how many are there?
Well, a lot fewer than there are American
you get
planes
my point, George.
ringed around Russia and China.
But George,
because
why are you so keen
because America
to take the Putin worldview?
No, I'm keen that Russia should not be broken up into Balkan states.
Who's going to do that?
That's the avowed intention.
But no one's attacking
the Rand report.
No one's
of
attacking
the think
Russia.
Tanks. Well, you say they're not attacking Russia.
They're not.
Crimea was yesterday shelled by an ATACMS missile programmed by the United States.
Crimea belongs to Ukraine.
It doesn't belong to Ukraine. You talked about
was literally
people
stolen.
voting.
It was stolen in 2014 by Vladimir Putin.
Well, does voting mean anything or not?
Well, you think the vote after they stole it matters? You think it has
the referendum that was held in Crimea, as any fool would have known the result would be, was at least 90% for rejoining Russia, rejoining being the operative word. The Crimea was an autonomous part of Ukraine during the Soviet era. The people of Crimea, like the people of eastern Ukraine now, wouldn't have been, if there hadn't been a war, if there hadn't been an invasion, if there hadn't been a coup, most people were content to live in an independent Ukraine, whether they were Russian people or Ukrainian people. And it's an important dichotomy that a third of them are Russian. They would have been happy to live under a democratic government in Kiev, but that's not what we have. First of all, his term has run out, but secondly, the overthrow of the legitimate government in 2014 led to a war of attrition against the people in eastern Ukraine, which turned the people more and more to the point of view that as Russian-speaking people, they're better off with Russia. We should have implemented the accords that France and Germany guaranteed and the Security Council subsequently adopted that would have guaranteed Ukrainian neutrality. There's nothing unusual about that. If Mexico or Canada decided to join a Chinese-Russian military bloc, America would never accept it. Neither will Russia accept.
Yeah, but Ukraine is now part of Ukraine is part of Europe. It's not part of Russia. It's not owned by Russia anymore. The truth is, Vladimir Putin wants to take back a lot of the stuff that he believes was wrongly broken up when the Soviet Union was dismantled.
I don't believe that is true.
I know you don't, but I'm curious why you constantly take it. He's even said that.
Russia is a European country. Moscow is the biggest city in Europe. It would have been far better for us to have accepted not just Russia, but Putin's own olive branches. He asked for Russia to join NATO.
Why would you? Here's the thing, George. Why do you trust Vladimir Putin?
Well, I trust him more than I trust Keir Starmer.
Really?
Yeah.
You trust Vladimir Putin?
I trust him
more than Keir Starmer?
I trust him more than I trust Joe Biden. I trust him more than I trust Donald Trump.
Hang on.
Hold on, let me finish the statement.
I can't really get past Starmer. You would trust Vladimir Putin more than Keir Starmer.
I wouldn't trust any of them if they told me what day it was today without checking. I don't trust automatically any politician. I check the facts. We lived through an era and were sacked because of the result of it, in which we were told certain things by our own leaders that turned out to be blatant lies.
Right, and here's my point, George. This is my point, is that you seem to have bought in to Putin's whole justification, as Farage has. He was provoked. He had no option.
There is no doubt.
To which I say bullshit. Right? This is a guy who proved in Grozny, who proved in Crimea, who proved in Georgia, and has proved again in Ukraine. He will attack where he smells weakness. And
no, I don't think that is true. But if it were to be true, then you'd find me on the same side of the argument.
But do you not think the invasion was an illegal invasion?
Yes, of course. Invading anyone's...
How can you justify it?
Well, for the same reason, I justified Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia to stop the tyranny of Pol Pot. And
you're likening Zelensky to Pol Pot?
I am, actually.
Oh, you can't be serious.
I am. For the thousands of children, women, who were killed by Ukraine's regime before Zelensky and after Zelensky, I think that the tyranny, the killing fields of the Donbass were as gruesome.
The killing fields of the Donbass have been perpetrated by Vladimir Putin.
No. The killing fields of the Donbass were from 2014 to Putin's invasion.
You think it's just stopped since he invaded?
I'm old enough to remember Tanzania invading Uganda to bring about the overthrow of big Idi Amin. It is not always the case that an intervention by a neighbour is a negative thing. And in the case of...
It's not an intervention. You just called it yourself an illegal invasion.
But
you said illegal.
It was an illegal invasion.
How can you justify it?
It was an illegal invasion. And the justification for it from the Russian-speaking Ukrainian point of view was to save them from massacre.
It's bullshit.
Well, they were being massacred.
No, they weren't. This is nonsense.
Just didn't notice it.
No.
You just didn't...
The massacring has been perpetrated by Putin on Ukrainian people. And, by the way, on his own people.
There's plenty of killing in Ukraine now.
Let me pick you up on one thing you said, which I want to clarify. This is what you said about the Bucha massacre. I've been to Bucha, so I want to play this clip.
So I don't believe that Bucha was a war crime. I believe it belongs in the long line of false flag operations used to trigger war.
False flag?
Absolutely. It was a massacre carried out.
Have you been there?
No, it was a...
Have you spoken to the people?
How could I go there? I'd be killed if I went there.
I have been there.
I'd be killed by...
I've been to the site of that massacre.
Because you're his friend. It's because you're shilling for him.
I'm not his friend.
Zelensky would have me killed if I went there. I am absolutely certain that the people who were massacred at Bucha were massacred by the Nazis that are the foundation stone of the existing Ukrainian state. The Azov Nazis were the people who carried out the Bucha massacre.
This is complete insanity.
How is it?
I don't even believe you think that.
I absolutely think it.
Why are you saying something like that?
Because I believe it.
But I've been there. I've literally interviewed the families of the people who were massacred.
You weren't there.
They were massacred by the Russian forces.
You weren't there when it happened.
I've spoken to the people who saw the Russian forces.
Well, I've also
raping and murdering their families.
Well, now we're back to... you always drag out this rape thing.
Yeah, because you know what? It happens a lot.
I haven't seen any reports of rape at Bucha.
Really?
So if
Why don't you go and check it out?
Well, I will. But
presumably you think it would be the Ukrainian Nazis who did it?
Well, they've certainly raped people before.
Right. So they're capable, but the Russian forces aren't.
Are you denying that there are Nazis in Ukraine?
I read a whole report about this. There is a tiny, tiny number of people associated themselves with the Nazi
All
ideology.
the statues, the Bandera.
Tiny
Well,
number.
they must be very influential if they're
By the way,
tiny.
there are Nazis here. There are Nazis in Germany.
Yeah, but we don't
there are
have
Nazis
streets.
in America.
We don't call streets after them.
No, but
we don't build monuments to them.
But George, how
we
can
don't
you-
call universities after them.
you cannot-
there's
you cannot
a
be
cult
serious.
of Nazism.
There's also
in
a cult
Ukraine.
of supporting people like Putin when they perpetrate atrocities like Bucha, right? And you seem to think that somehow in your head he didn't do that.
You said that there are a tiny number of Nazis in Ukraine. Then why is the main street in Kiev called after Bandera? Why is Bandera and his Nazi collaborating gang proliferating statues, street names, institutions being called after them? Why do they carry Nazi flags and insignia?
There is, I can tell you,
tattoos.
There is a tiny percentage of Nazis in Ukraine. Tiny.
Because you've been there, you can say that.
Yes.
Yeah?
And because I've spoken to people who know.
And I have spoken to people who know.
Right. But you
and
think
I have
this
read
massacre
more than
that
one report.
I witnessed the scene of this massacre with
report.
my own eyes.
Yeah.
I talked to the people who'd lost their loved ones, who had appalling things done to them. It was done by Russian invading forces.
I believe that Bucha, in all the circumstances, is a false flag of the kind with which we are wearily familiar. That you commit an atrocity and you blame it in order to manufacture consent for what comes next. You blame it on the bogeyman.
So you think the Ukraine was behind the Russian forces advancing through to that area, and then they stopped because they blew up the bridge?
These people were murdered.
You think they did all this?
These people were murdered because they were Russian collaborators.
They were murdered by Russia.
They weren't. Well,
Vladimir Putin's forces murdered hundreds and hundreds of people.
In Bucha.
Yes.
How many hundreds were killed?
I don't know the exact number.
That's funny because you've been there and you've read a report.
I think it was. Was it 400?
I've seen pictures of the slaughtered people, who were all wearing the
458.
Ribbons. They were. You've got somebody speaking in your ear.
Because I said I thought it was about 400. It turns out it was 458.
The people that I saw on television were wearing armbands which identified them as Russian collaborators, people who'd taken the soup from the then occupying Russian forces. We're not going to get anywhere batting this one around. My stance is this. The Russian-speaking people in Ukraine decided they wanted out of Ukraine. They have a right to self-determination. The coup and the massacres that ensued after it in 2014, the abolition of their language, the criminalization of their culture, led them to conclude that they no longer wanted to be part of that kind of Ukraine. It would be far better if we now negotiate. And as Macron said.
All right, what would you do? What would you
Farage, let's partition Ukraine.
How?
Along, if you get me a map, I'll show you the very river along.
Well, you give them what the Russians are taking.
The Dnieper River would be a reasonable place to partition.
So they invade Crimea and they get to keep it.
Well,
they now invade the Donbass region and they get to keep that.
Crimea for hundreds of years has been Russian.
Fine.
Odessa.
Actually, it was Ukrainian territory.
Well, it was
because
it was. Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine when both were part of the Soviet Union.
Right.
That doesn't stop it being Russian. It doesn't mean the Russian Navy anchored there for hundreds of years.
To be clear, he invades Crimea and gets to keep it. He now invades the southeast region, the Donbass and other parts of that area, and he gets to keep that too. That's how you would settle this.
Well, we need to negotiate.
Would you let Putin keep what he's taking?
I said right at the beginning, George is better than war. I'm saying it about Ukraine too. You can have a war if you like. You could send your sons, you'll never send mine, to go and fight for which side of a line.
I understand, but to be clear, you would let him keep what he's...
When he's been in 4 countries in 100
years. But your idea of
years.
negotiation is to let him keep what he's taken.
Well, I think the people need to vote.
But is that what you would think is a reasonable thing?
I think
to partition it?
I think a reasonable thing to do would be for the United Nations to conduct a plebiscite amongst the people of Eastern Ukraine as to which state they wanted to be in. And I'm pretty sure that overwhelmingly they choose to be in Russia.
What part of you, and look, I don't want to be disrespectful, but what part of you is so naive, George, that you think that Putin, having done it in Crimea and now done it in the Donbass, in the east of Ukraine, and got what he wanted, got what he took with force, that he's going to stop there and not want the rest of Ukraine?
Well, he's the one who was ready to negotiate, and at Istanbul, 2 months.
No, he wasn't.
2 months into the war, yes, he was.
He could negotiate this tomorrow.
No, look, Boris Johnson was sent specifically to scupper the outcome of the Istanbul negotiations 2 months into the war, long before hundreds of thousands of people had died and thousands of square kilometers.
Why would you trust Putin?
Of territory. Well, I don't trust people I have to negotiate with. I have to negotiate with people or fight them. I don't want to fight the Russians. I don't want to fight the Chinese. Apart from anything else, we're in no position to fight either.
What happens if he decides he wants a piece of the UK?
Well, my goodness, the state of the UK, it would be exceedingly unlikely that he'd want
But
to.
what if he does? What if he sniffs a bit of weakness?
Well,
what if he hears you and Nigel Farage and thinks, wow, British politicians seem really bang up for me at the moment?
Honestly, fantasy talk, Piers. I'm
Is
surprised at you. It's unbecoming.
Is
of
it
you.
fantasy talk?
It is. The truth is, the negotiations could have solved this problem even before it began. The accords, the Minsk agreements, could have been implemented, and there would have been no war at all. The reason why they weren't implemented, and the reason the Istanbul Agreement was scuppered, was because the West wanted the war. That's what Farage means when he talks about provoked. That's what increasing numbers of European governments...
The West didn't want the war in Ukraine? Why would he want a war somewhere where there's like 25% of the world's wheat comes from? That would cause a massive global wheat crisis.
They want to...
Why would they want that, George?
They want to weaken and destroy the Russian state. They've said so. They think, and the Prime Minister of Latvia said it just yesterday, they want Russia broken up into its ethnic parts so that it becomes a balkanized proliferation of states, the better to be exploited. So I think the best thing to do, and Farage is right, is to negotiate an end to this. The longer we wait to negotiate,
you're not really
the
talking...
more disadvantageous those negotiations will be. Or fight. I mean, that's the alternative.
But do you understand why...
We could go to war for...
Do you understand you're sounding very like Neville Chamberlain?
No, I'm the last man to accuse of being an appeaser of fascism. I'm the person here
Sounds like exactly what you're doing, George.
I'm denouncing the fascism in Ukraine that you are turning a
But you think the only fascists in all this are in Ukraine?
Yeah.
Right, you don't think Putin's a fascist?
I think people waving swastikas, we should believe them.
What about ruthless Russian dictators?
When they show you the SS insignia, we should believe them.
And when a Russian dictator invades country after country after country?
You're talking as if there's only me and Farage who are thinking like this. But that's not true. Your former pal, Donald Trump, is going to end this war in a month.
How do you think he's going to do that?
On, because you're going to withdraw support for the man you think is a hero.
I bet he doesn't do that.
Well, we'll come back in December.
In
February and see.
As with all things Trump, actually, judge him on what he actually does, not what he says from time to time, is my best advice on that. I don't think he'll look like he wants to give Putin...
If the war doesn't end before, it will end after Trump takes office.
Who's going to win the US election?
Donald Trump by a landslide.
Do you think so?
By a landslide.
Yeah.
Unless they rig it, unless Trump is stopped with extreme prejudice, he's on a roll that can't be stopped. A better question is, who will the Democratic opponent be?
Right. Should they get rid of Biden before it's too late?
Well, if his trousers fall down in the presidential debate...
Which they might.
And they might, and it might not be a pretty sight, one way or another. They might ditch him, but it's getting late in the day.
Two quick things before I let you go. Julian Assange has been released, and he's off to this little tiny court in the middle of nowhere where they're going to do a deal, apparently 62 months, which is the time he served in Belmarsh. Then he can go back home to Australia. I mean, I was quite surprised to wake up to that this morning. I didn't think this was going to happen. What do you think of Julian Assange? Some people think he's a hero. Some people think he's a villain. Some people are a bit more nuanced about him with a bit of both.
Well, I've been with him from the beginning. I could show you my scars, blackballed, blacklisted, lost jobs. I was sacked from the Daily Record and from the Holyrood magazine. 2 of my columns wiped out because of my support for Assange over what turned out to be fake rape allegations against him. I think he's one of the greatest heroes of the field of letters of the last century and this. I think the quality of his work is almost without peer. I think he's been treated monstrously by successive British governments, and interestingly, the man that is emerging at the centre of some of these things is Keir Starmer. If you needed another reason to dislike Keir Starmer, look at his role in what has happened to Julian Assange.
To be honest with you, I can't still quite get over the fact you would trust Putin more than Starmer. I mean, that's quite a statement.
Starmer, Biden, Trump, Sunak, I'd trust Putin more than any of them because they're my leaders. They're the leaders of my part of the world, and they betrayed me and they betrayed their own people time and time and time again. So if I was negotiating with Putin, I would look him straight in the eye. I'd put to him the Piers Morgan question. Do you intend to take a piece of Britain? I think I could rely on him when he said, I certainly do not.
Really?
Russia is the biggest country in the world. It's one of the richest countries in the world, fourth richest economy in the world now. It is indissolubly linked now to China. What an achievement of American statecraft. Nixon and Kissinger spent all that time trying to keep Russia and China apart. We have driven them together to the extent that they are now hip to hip, joined at the hip, and growing numbers of countries, some of whom were once allies, satraps even, of ours, are joining the BRICS, joining the Shanghai Cooperation.
The problem is, George, he'll be watching this interview, I'm sure, Vladimir Putin, and he'll have already heard you say that, yeah, if you invade stuff like Crimea and the Donbass, you get to keep it. And he'll be thinking, why can't I do that in the UK?
If the people vote for it. No, if the people vote for it.
That's the problem with appeasing dictators.
No, but he's not a dictator.
He's a dictator.
He's got a better mandate from the people than Rishi Sunak, never faced a vote.
Why do you think that is?
Rishi Sunak's never been voted by anybody.
Rishi Sunak doesn't kill and imprison his political opponents.
Well, ask Julian Assange, who nearly died.
Well, who was killing him? Rishi Sunak?
The British government nearly killed Julian Assange because he was a journalist and a troublemaker for the powerful, for the establishment, because he revealed truths about the conflict that you and I think, quite gallantly opposed. He revealed truths that our leaders don't want us to know. If you think our governments don't kill anybody, you need to listen to Donald Trump's interview with Leslie Stahl, in which he said we've killed a lot of people,
of course,
including our own president.
Of course the Americans have killed us.
So the fact is that Putin was recently re-elected. He was re-elected with a thumping majority.
Yeah, because
more thumping.
He imprisons or kills his political opponents.
No, I don't accept that.
You don't accept that?
No, I don't accept that.
George, you can't even look at me. You don't accept it.
Did you see Donald Trump in the court the other day?
Where was Alexei Navalny when he died?
Do you know? Well, where is Donald Trump going to be come November?
Keep switching it to Trump.
Well, because you keep describing
I'm asking you about one particular leader.
Well, Navalny died, as it turns out.
Why was he in prison?
He was in prison for
what?
For bank fraud.
No, he wasn't.
He was in prison for bank fraud.
He was in prison because he was the biggest vocal opponent of Vladimir Putin.
Well, he wasn't very big.
You can't be this naive, George.
He wasn't very big, and he died of natural causes.
He was a very big vocal opponent, and he was in prison
he wasn't remotely
trumped-up
big.
charges.
He represented 1-2% of the Russian electorate. You're not doing our country or yourself any favours by imagining or pretending to imagine that Putin doesn't fully represent the Russian people. He does.
Oh, no.
And the more we're at war with him, the more he will.
I do not underestimate his ability to terrorise his people into devoted slavish support.
136
because you know
million
what?
people have been terrorised into voting.
If you go out and
Putin.
Protest in the streets of Russia against Putin, what happens to you?
That just isn't true.
What happens to you?
There's more opposition to the Russian government in Russia than there is opposition to the British and American governments in Britain and America.
You would go over to Russia.
There are TV stations.
You would walk down the middle of a high street in the middle of Moscow with a banner saying Putin must go.
No, because I'm a foreigner.
You know why you wouldn't, George?
I would have no
he'd
right
put you in a prison
to do that. I don't accept
in a gulag for the rest of your life, or he'd poison you.
We're just not on the same page.
No, we're not.
But it doesn't matter what we think of Putin. All that matters is that he is the president of a nuclear-armed superpower, fourth biggest economy in the world, the largest country in the world, better to deal with them than to constantly wave swords at him that are, in any case, woefully insufficient.
Did you ever get bullied at school?
To fight. Yes.
What did you do with the bully?
I fought them back.
Exactly. Punched him in the nose.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Are you going to punch Russia in the nose?
I think we should stand very strongly.
You and whose army?
NATO, actually, which is a much bigger army than his.
So are we off to war then?
Where?
Are we off to war in the Ukraine?
One thing, well, we're in war in Ukraine.
I'm glad you've acknowledged that.
Well, we are in the sense
That's what Russia's been saying, and the West has been
we are
denying.
supplying the weaponry they're using.
Yeah, you're right. We're in the war.
To me, we're in this war, right?
You've acknowledged it. You've acknowledged it. We're at war with Russia.
Well,
let's see how we get on with that.
We are supplying the weapons for Ukraine to wage its war.
I think you'll find when you wind this back that you said we're in the war.
Well,
we are. You were telling the truth.
I don't think you can argue.
We're in the war.
Yeah.
And let's see how
I believe we are helping defend
ends.
a democratic sovereign country.
And are you ready
from
to
a
sacrifice?
Dictator.
Are you ready to sacrifice?
You think he's a much misunderstood guy who actually deserves to take it all?
Are you ready to sacrifice us all, including our own children?
A lot of my family have fought in wars. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you ready to sacrifice them for Ukraine?
I'm more worried about whether my kids have to end up being conscripted if Russia attacks us, which they might do if they sense that we are weak. And right now, they're hearing a lot of political leaders like you and Nigel Farage who are sounding remarkably pro-Putin.
Well, I'm just pro-peace. I'm against war.
That's not pro-peace.
I'm against war.
Against what? Unless it's your Russia, mate, invading Ukraine.
Especially against nuclear war. Because then, neither us, nor our lineage, nor anyone else's lineage, no cell of our being will exist.
Why hasn't he invaded a NATO country?
He didn't invade Ukraine because he wants to take other people's countries. He invaded Ukraine to stop the massacre of Russians in Ukraine.
What utter nonsense, George. Honestly.
Well,
That's not why he invaded Ukraine.
He invaded Ukraine.
He invaded Ukraine like he invaded Crimea so he can take a large swathe of the country and its people.
No, I don't.
And you want to give it to him.
Well, he's got it. Question is, do you want to have a war to take it back? And you've said, to be fair, you're ready.
Yeah.
And
actually, in answer to that question, I believe there is no point in having a nuclear deterrent if you allow the other guy who's got a lot of nuclear weapons to rattle them and terrify you into being his subordinate.
Yeah. Subordinate, it's about Kupiansk. It's not about Tunbridge Wells. So you have said on your show, you're ready to send your children to war to decide which side of a line Kupiansk lies when it's been in 4 countries in 100 years. I'm not. I'm prepared to die to defend Tunbridge Wells. You may be surprised.
So you're prepared to die to defend sovereign democracy?
I'm a British...
Just not if it's not here.
I'm a British politician, and I will die to defend Britain and its legitimate
What if he invaded
interests.
France or Germany?
I wouldn't die for Macron or Schultz.
So only here?
Only here.
You'd only die for here?
I think that we have a duty to defend the interests of our own people.
And no duty to defend democracy?
Our own... But what's democratic about what we have? This democracy you talk of is a farce. Trump versus Biden, that's your democracy? You want me to die for that? That democracy is a farce. It's a farce when people who need $1.5 billion even to run against the incumbent president, that is inherently farcical. When it is 2 octogenarians, one pooing his pants in front of the Pope, the other from behind bars in a cell for paying a hookah money, hush money, out of his company accounts, that's democracy.
She wasn't a prostitute. Stormy Daniels wasn't a prostitute. She was an adult entertainer.
An adult entertainer.
They're different.
Okay.
Let me end on something completely different. I've enjoyed our debate, by the way. Let's end on with this, which is extraordinarily, you told me something before we came on air, that you were watching my interview with Fiona Harvey, who is the real-life Martha from Baby Reindeer.
Yeah.
And you suddenly revealed to me that you had a problem with her in your life. Tell me about it.
I saw her sitting in this chair. I was riveted by your interview, which, by the way, was a master class. Morgan at his best.
Thank you.
It took me right back to the 1980s when stalking was up close and personal, because there was no emails, there was no texting. You had to either phone someone on their landline or turn up at their door. That's real stalking. And that's what she did to me.
In what way?
She was forever on my case. She was a member of the Labour Party. I think you got that out of her. She was a member of the Labour Party in my Hillhead constituency. I had just been elected MP in 1987, defeating Roy Jenkins. And suddenly I find this obsessive woman in my midst. And everywhere I turned, she was there. And at first I thought that she fancied me. But it turned out that she fancied my job. And so she was a relentless and physical, up close and personal, stalker of mine. And I'm ready to testify.
How many times did she try and call you, for example?
She called me hundreds of times.
Really?
Hundreds of times. And she showed up probably hundreds of times.
Really? At
in
your
the
home?
most inappropriate places.
Ever at your
my
home?
office, wherever she discovered that we were, me and my staff and my inner circle, she'd breeze in. Exactly the things that she acknowledged that she had done. I mean, turns out that Netflix said she had done and been certain things, places that she hadn't. So I wish her the best in her legal action.
Well, they said she'd
them.
been convicted, which wasn't the case. She'd never been to court by the look of it.
Yeah.
But you also knew the Scottish lawyer and her MP husband.
Yes.
Laura Ray.
Laura Ray, who was a distinguished lawyer and the wife of a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, God rest his soul, Jimmy Ray MP, W-R-A-Y. Jimmy, she quite fancied Jimmy's job too. I mean, she was...
Did you talk to Jimmy about her?
Yeah, and I've talked to Laura
Really?
about her, and since your interview with her. So it was, on one level, chilling, on another level, hilarious, to see that face and to hear that voice again.
Did she ever threaten you?
No, but she...
Did you fear she might harm you?
Yeah, I think when someone's obsessive, you're always afraid that that obsession might take a sudden twist and a potentially dangerous twist, but she never did harm me or threaten to harm me. She was just in my life when I didn't want her to be.
When was the last time you heard from her?
The last time I saw her would be around the early 1990s, and I hadn't seen her again until I saw her on your show. I didn't, of course, at that point know that she was the person being alleged to be the baby reindeer. Although I had watched Baby Reindeer, but I had no idea that it was her. And then when I saw her on your show, it took me right back to the salad days of the 1980s.
Extraordinary. And sent a chill up your spine.
Yeah, well, a little bit. And a laugh out my throat. I mean, as I say, simultaneously chilling and hilarious at the same time.
A little bit like our interview, George.
A bit.
But it's good to catch up with you.
And you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Good luck.